The basic idea is that every economic system has in it conflicting forces. The language in Marxism is internal contradictions. The system has in it problems it is constantly struggling with because they're built into the system. And for long periods of time, it finds solutions. But in the end, historical materialism says, the internal contradictions become unmanageable, and then there's a kind of explosion, the system dies, and a new one is born. So we had slavery, for example, in various parts of the world. It was born, it evolved, it had its contradictions. For example, the contradiction that the only way a slave system can continue is if you replace the slaves that reach old age and die, and that's become a big problem for many slave societies. And so eventually, the slavery couldn't solve its problems, and it died, replaced by feudalism in Europe, which went through the parallel process, and then it blew up. It couldn't solve its problems. So historical materialism begins to look at capitalism through the same lens. What are the internal contradictions? How do they bedevil the system? What solutions for a while have they found? But when and where might we get to a level of internal contradiction that makes the system tremble, makes it vulnerable, and at that point, if revolutionaries can see and understand what's going on, they can intervene to move to the next system, to get beyond this. Just like rebels overthrew slavery, rebels overthrew feudalism, the expectation of Marx was that capitalism would generate the contradictions, then the tensions, then the failed solutions that would then bring into being the rebels with the ideas of criticism, Marx himself being one of those, who would eventually move to the next system. To illustrate it as concretely as I can, let me give you an example of the kind of contradiction Marx found in capitalism that has been crucial for everybody else. And I pick it because it's so relevant right now in the United States and around the world. Every capitalist, I think most of the folks watching know this just from their personal life. Every capitalist is always trying to either make more money or survive competitively by saving on his labor costs. One capitalist does it by substituting machines for working people, automating, getting a computer to do what he used to have 50 people do, etc., etc. Another capitalist does it by trying to get cheaper workers in place of more expensive ones, hiring women, if they're less expensive, to do the job that they used to pay men more for, hiring immigrants rather than native folks, moving to another part of the world where wages are much lower. We all know that. So capitalists are always trying to save on labor costs because they can make a better profit if they do that. But here comes the contradiction. If all capitalists are reducing the number of workers they pay or reducing the pay they give to their workers, what will result is that the working people have less and less money. And if they have less and less money, they can't buy what the capitalists are producing to sell. The capitalists, therefore, are destroying themselves, but they have no choice. They have to save on the labor outlay, and then that comes back and bites them in the rear end because there's no demand. If you've been so successful becoming rich as a capitalist, you've killed yourself. These kinds of contradictions, for Marx, are the beginning of the end of a system. It papers it over. For example, when people couldn't buy in the 1970s, the capitalist system kept going anyway. How did it do that? How did it keep going when the people didn't have enough money from their wages to buy? The solution was credit. We loaded the world up. House credit, that's your mortgage. Car payment credit, nobody buys a car except by paying out. Credit cards, which didn't exist before the 1970s for anything but traveling businessmen, and only a small number of them. And then when that was not enough, we loaded up, for the first time in American history, an entire generation of students who can't get a degree without loading up with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. We kept the system going. People could buy stuff even though their wages didn't pay for it by borrowing. And in 2008, the predictable happened. It turned out your fix only lasts for a while. You really have to ask, in a way that many of us as Marxists haven't done for most of our lives, the problems of capitalism now are so severe, so systemic, so global that we're beginning to wonder whether this system is going to find a way out. The Marxists are not the only ones wondering whether this system is coming to an end. The people on the other side of the political fence are very worried too.
Yeah, you have billionaires writing op-eds. The
Absolutely.
pitchforks are coming for the plutocrats because they know what's coming. Let's talk about the bubbles. You're talking about the housing bubble, and I think that this is a really interesting indication. The housing crisis, the crisis of overproduction, the fact that we have more houses than we do homeless people. But because you had this crisis of overproduction, too much of something was produced and people couldn't utilize it. I mean, talk about that concept and why this is an inescapable phenomenon under capitalism.
Starting in the 1970s, American businesses began to have what I like to call a eureka moment. They realized that in the West, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, 100 and 200 years of capitalism had built up impressive factories, offices, stores. But they were built up in the places where capitalism was born, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. That's where they had concentrated everything. And that's where they had drawn workers in off the countryside to become urban, industrialized working classes. And along the way, the workers, noticing how productive capitalism was since they did the work, demanded for themselves a rising standard of living. So roughly, from 1820 to 1970, particularly in the United States but elsewhere, wages rose. That's what, over that time, capitalists were doing so well they could raise the wages of their workers and still make out like bandits. So it was a system in which people began to get the idea capitalism works. It delivers the goods because it raises wages. You had to not look at what was happening to where most people in the world lived, Asia, Africa, Latin America, because for them the situation was horrible. But if you concentrated on where capitalism was born, you could fool yourself into thinking, wow, this is a system that works. And the capitalists, of course, and the people who liked it celebrated all of that. Then in the 1970s, capitalists had this eureka moment. They said to themselves, wait a minute. We're in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, where the wages are now very high. Workers are very happy. But why are we here? In the rest of the world, which has been savaged by the growth of capitalism in those privileged areas, wages are very low. So in this eureka moment, capitalists said, what are we doing here in Western Europe, North America, and Japan? It's much more profitable if we produce in China, in India, in Brazil, anywhere else. And there begins what we're still in the middle of, the exodus, the abandonment of the places of origin of capitalism by the capitalists. So there's a massive move to China, India, Brazil, and all those places, producing what? Well, what every capitalist wants, which is to make a bundle. So they build big factories, imagining that they can sell all of this stuff like they used to. But they forgot something. If you go from high wages in the United States to low wages in China, the bottom line is that the people earning wages are earning a lot less than they used to. It's not just that they're not Americans, they're Chinese, but they can't buy back what you're building. They can't manage to consume what you have the capacity to produce. Right now, China is slowing down, scaring the whole world. But it's not China that's slowing down. It's the inability of China to sell to the world because the wages of the world's workers have been depressed now for years as we move out of Western Europe, North America, and Japan into these lower. And the system totters as it encounters a very old contradiction in its current form for which they have no solution. And right now, when it's happening on a global scale, Europe is having it, North America is having it, Japan. These are the centers of capitalism. They're in the most trouble right now, and they don't see a way out, and I don't either, which makes it possible, for the first time in my life, to begin to see a capitalism that is in fundamental shaking difficulty.